Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth CTIS bite-sized talk on modifications. My name is Vasiliki Papaioannou, and I'm a change management officer working for EMA. Before introducing the CTIS experts that will be presenting today, I would like to quickly remind our attendees of the concept of the bite-sized talks, as well as a few housekeeping rules. Each bite-sized talk covers a specific CTIS functionality, and today the functionality of modifications will be presented and demonstrated in the system as seen on this agenda slide. While throughout the sessions, you may ask your questions as always. We will be using Slido to collect questions, and here you can see how to use this tool. Please go to www.slido.com or www.slide.do and enter the code May31. In the Slido session, you can type in your questions and upvote other users' questions that you would like to see answered. As we aim to answer the most popular questions first, please ensure to make use of the thumbs up feature. Please also keep the questions focused on CTIS modifications so we can best answer them. Now, if the video screen is blurry or otherwise difficult to view, please read the instructions in the gray box underneath the video on the event page. There, you can find a link to watch the live broadcast in full screen. This link is also posted as an announcement in Slido for you to see and use as soon as you enter the Slido session. And finally, once in full screen mode, if you like to, you can opt to increase the video quality by clicking the HD button on the right bottom of the screen, and you can set it up to 720p or 1080p. Now, having said that, I would like to introduce our speakers, Noemi and Peter. Noemi Manent joined EMA in March 2011 as a principal scientific administrator in the compliance and inspection sector. Today, she is leading the CTIS operations work stream, enabling the application of the clinical trial regulation. Peter van Kierbergen studied industrial pharmacy, obtained a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences and a master's degree in informatics. After 4 years in R&D, he joined the Belgian authorities in 2000, leading various projects. From 2016, he led their R&D department for clinical trials and unmet medical need. In this role, he was a member state product owner for the CTIS project. And since August 2020, Peter is head of EMA Clinical Workstream and CTIS Program Manager. Now, I hand over to Noemi to show us an introductory presentation on modifications before moving on with the Q&A and live demo sessions. Noemi, over to you.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and very welcome to this fourth bite-sized talk. So the topic of today is modification, and as you will see from the demonstration, we will focus primarily on substantial modification. So what needs to be understood is that obviously substantial modifications in CTIS can be prepared, can be drafted, but they can only be submitted in certain conditions. And this is also what we're going to actually see today. One important point that we would like to probably bring forward to this meeting, especially in the sense that you've already probably attended bite size on RFI, etc. One important message from the sponsors is obviously the preparation of the information that will be submitted to the member state. So the best time and the best effort you put in preparing the documentation, the less you will have questions from the member state. And this is what I think there is a message on the screen here saying, do focus on the quality of your dossier before you actually submit it, and see how we can actually help you to do this during the preparation of the substantial modification. Next slide, please. So this is a busy slide, but this is a slide that in fact is summarizing the way you can actually prepare the substantial modification and when you can actually submit it. So at the very top, you will see when you are allowed to submit a substantial modification when there is an ongoing evaluation of an application. And on the left-hand side, you will see these are the very different scenarios. So we will look at the first scenario. There is an ongoing activity by the member states. They are currently assessing an initial application. What can you do as a sponsor? As a sponsor, you can certainly prepare a substantial modification, but you will not be able to submit it until a decision is issued by all member states concerned that are obviously looking at this initial application. I think that's a very important concept to understand at this point in time. This is the current setup of CTIS. There is a potential change that will take place in the future, but for the time being, this is the current setup of CTIS. So whenever there's an initial application that is ongoing and under evaluation, the sponsor is not able, they are able to obviously prepare their substantial modification, but they cannot submit. Then on the next row, what you see here is that whilst there is an ongoing activity, an ongoing assessment of a part 1 and part 2 substantial modification application, the sponsor is able to prepare, but the sponsor is not able to submit any substantial modification. Whether this substantial modification is a part 1 or part 2, whether it's only part 1 only or part 2 only. Okay. And it's the same for a non-substantial modification, and obviously that will be the same for an additional MSc application. If we look at the third row now, on the if there's an ongoing part 1 only substantial modification, I think it's the same as above. The sponsor will be able to prepare, but will not be able to submit. And then in the case of an evaluation of a part 2 only substantial modification, as we can see here, obviously the sponsor will be able to prepare substantial modification, but they will not be able to submit a part 1 or part 2 substantial modification. They will not be able to submit a part 1 only substantial modification, but then they will be able to obviously submit a part 2 only substantial modification to another MSc that is currently not evaluating the current part 2 substantial modification. For the non-substantial modification, the rule is very similar, obviously, and this is why currently it says no, because if there's an ongoing substantial modification assessment, the submission of a non-substantial modification is not possible currently. So, and in the last row, I think this is that will be the topic of another bite-sized talk. But then you have obviously you have the visibility that in case of an Article 14, if currently there is an assessment of an additional MSc application, the sponsor is only able to submit a part 2 only substantial modification to another MS, to another member state concern. So next slide, please. So this slide is quite colorful here, but just to present you what are the various sections of the dossier that can be modified during a substantial modification. And I think here you can see from the form, obviously, there's most of the information can be changed. The only thing to point out is the deferral section you will not be able to amend it during a substantial modification, as currently the system does not enable this. In terms of the MSc section, obviously the sponsor will be able to update the number of subjects per MSc, but obviously you cannot add an MSc at this point in time. And then in the part 1, as you can see, you can modify any of the structured data and any of the documents. And for the part 2, it's the same. You can currently modify the trial sites and the documentation that is associated to this section of the part 2. Next slide, please. So this is the visualization of what can be done, can be changed in a non-substantial modification. As you can see in the form, it's only the modification description that can be appended to the form section. And in terms of the MSc, you can certainly amend the number of subjects per MSc. And in the part one, as you can see, there are some some section whereby the data translation documentation can be modified. You've got also the third-party entities as well as the contact details and the description of changes that can be appended, changed. For the part two, we've got the PI contact details that can be amended. We've got documents as well as translation of documents that can be uploaded. Next slide, please. And this is the slide to present the timers in terms of, in a way, to translate what the clinical trial regulation is proposing in terms of assessment. Obviously, this is presented in the sense that these are the maximum timers that would be enabled in the system. So as we can see for part one, part two, or part one only, there is a validation time that takes place over 6 calendar days. And in the terms, if they were to have a part two only substantial modification, the same would apply, 6 days as well, six calendar days. And then if we move to the part one assessment, we've got, obviously, this would be done in a jointly fashion if it was to involve more than one MSc. And here we've got up to 38 days for the part one conclusion to be issued. And for the part two assessment, it's the same timing, 38 days. And I would like to remind you, these are calendar days, obviously. And then once that timing is passed, we have 5 days for the member state to issue their decision on the application for part one and part two, or part one only application. For the part two only substantial modification, the timers are fairly similar. But what needs to be pointed out is that obviously the part two assessment will take over 33 days in order to accommodate for the decision to take place over 5 days consecutive to this decision, to this conclusion of the part two. Next slide, please. And then this is just to remind you that the scope of a substantial modification, as I've already mentioned it, we've got either the SM, the substantial modification that includes part one and part two changes. We've got the one that includes only the part one and the one that only includes the part two. Next slide, please.
We can now start with the first round of questions and answers. I will share the questions in Slido. So we have some questions, and if you agree, I can start reading the first one, the most popular one. Could you please confirm if a substantial modification can be submitted in Ctis, even if a non-substantial modification was just submitted? Over to you.
Thank you. Noemi, would you like to take this, please?
So for this question, absolutely. The non-substantial modification is submitted straight away to the system. It doesn't involve an assessment. So as soon as it is submitted, then the sponsor is absolutely able to then prepare and submit another, let's say, a substantial modification. Yes, absolutely, it's possible.
Thank you, Noemi. The next question is which cases require a substantial modification after temporary halt to restart the trial? In which cases is it sufficient to enter a date for the restart via the restart trial without submitting anything? Do we get a confirmation that we are allowed to restart? So there are 3 questions in one, so feel free to answer them, yes, as best way.
Okay, so for this particular one, and if we were to put the question back on, I think as Vicky was mentioning, there were several questions. So for I think it's quite clearly stipulated in the clinical trial regulation that in order to restart a trial for which there was a halt that was linked to the benefit risks, in such a case, the sponsor would need to submit a substantial modification. So this is very much linked to the notification that the sponsor would have submitted to the member state to inform them that the trial is put on hold. And within their notification, they would have mentioned that it's obviously linked to benefit risks. So in such a case, the sponsor would have to submit a substantial modification that is requesting the restart with obviously a date that they would need to provide in the future. So I think that should answer the question. And in which cases is it sufficient to enter the date for restart via the restart trial without submitting anything? I'm afraid in the case that I've just mentioned, in case it is related to the benefit risk, you will not be able to restart the trial without submitting a substantial modification and having it approved. In the case of a halt that is not linked to benefit risks, we could give an example where potentially you would be the supplies have not yet arrived at the site. So in such a case, you would like to put the trial on hold. Then in such a case, you are able to restart the trial without a substantial modification. And such a way is already able in the system. So in such a case, you would just need to restart the trial using the notification button that are available in the system. So in case you would restart the trial, yes, there is by way of informing not just yourself, but also member states that would need to be notified that in the case that I've just mentioned, a scenario where the halt was not due to benefit risks, then in such a case, obviously, there would be what we call a notice. A notice of restart would have been submitted in the dashboard, and you could access those. So obviously, if you have, according to the user role and permission, you would have access to this notice.
Thank you, Noemi. We'll move to the next question. Is a non-substantial modification an application? Or is a non-substantial modification just an update that is not reviewed by the member states nor FIs?
So I think it's a good question because in fact, as you will see in the system, the current labeling of the non-substantial modification is also called application. I think we have to say that this was just to keep within the format and labeling of the rest of the work that was presented on the user interface. So it is not per se an application that requires assessment. It doesn't require a request for information from the member states, not at all. However, what needs to be mentioned is that whatever information you would submit as a sponsor to the system and to the member states would be reviewed in time, obviously, by the member states, and they could certainly send you a question using a special functionality that is called the ad hoc functionality, by which there is a way for them to ask question and to raise an RFI. However, this RFI obviously doesn't have the same weight as any RFI that is used within the context of an assessment of a part 1 or part 2, or even validation, because it wouldn't bring the application to lapse or the trial to lapse at all. No, it's just a way for the member state to communicate with the sponsor and request information if they think it's required.
Thank you. So the next most popular question asks, Will the previous term amendment be accepted as well, or will we need to use modification, for example, in the cover letter?
Hi Noemi. I think that this would depend on how the member states are looking at this. No.
Yeah, I think that's. I think the question of whether you want to use amendment of modification within your documentation, I think this is really up to you to decide how you want to implement the clinical trial regulation. It's true that the documentation does not the regulation doesn't mention amendments anymore, but to be honest, substantial modification and amendments are really synonymous, really. So I guess it's really for you to decide what is best in terms of consistency within your documentation. I think that's the advice I would give you.
Thank you. Moving on to the next one. From slide 7, non-substantial modifications are not possible during any application, initial CTA, SM, or additional member state. If this is correct, are sponsors expected to incorporate Article 81.9 non-SM within existing SMEs?
I think that's correct. That's very correct. And I think that's the advice that the European Commission has actually provided within probably some of the clarification and responses that they've given to questions. So I think correct. When you have a substantial modification that you're preparing one and you foresee that you will have some non-substantial modifications, some changes that you would like to provide, clarification that you would like to make, certainly use the facility of the substantial modification and inform the member state about this. I think that's currently the best way to make sure that the changes are taking place and are published as well as you would like.
Right. Next question is on transitional trials. When can a substantial modification part 1 be submitted? As soon as the first member state concerned has approved the transition trial, or just after the last member state concerned has approved?
Yeah, on this one, this is why we presented you with the table that was a bit busy there. And it's very much the later. So you would, in order for you to be able to submit a substantial modification, you would need to wait for the last MSc to have decided, to have submitted their decision. This is this rule is not just valid for transitional trial; it's valid for across the board for any trials. As soon as there is an application that is being assessed, the sponsor needs to wait for all the member states to have issued their decision on that application.
Right. Thank you. Following question. What is the expiration time for a substantial modification or RFI? Is it midnight of the due date?
Thank you. And yes, Noemi, I think it's also Amsterdam time. Eh?
I think that's a very good point. It is, yes, absolutely. It is, and it is midnight, correct? So it might be just a few seconds before midnight, but that's what it is, yes, currently.
Thank you. We can take a couple more questions before starting with the first demo session, if you agree. All right. So next one. When is it expected to have a functionality to change the sponsor in a substantial modification? Over to you.
Yes, I can explain for the we are working to provide a date on this, right, Noemi?
So currently it's not possible. We confirm. So this is not possible at this point in time. And as Peter mentioned, we are working to upgrade the functionality. This is currently in discussion within the prioritization group, I think. So this is unfortunately I don't think we can give you a time exactly of when it will take place, but this is currently definitely on the pipeline now.
Very nice, thank you. And we can have one more question. Is there a list of all the hard and soft tasks for a substantial modification?
This is member state functionality.
I think this is this question is in relation to the workflow and the way the member state will actually assess an application. So whether it's an initial or a substantial modification, they are effectively what we call soft task. But this is very much to support the work of the member state, especially in a joint application. So the users are asking for a list. I think we could probably verify whether the training material doesn't provide sufficient information on that. But what I would say is that the soft tasks are not essential to be followed, because I think, as we know, for mononational, the member states, for instance, doesn't necessarily need to upload a draft assessment report. But obviously, the conclusion to the part one is essential. So it needs to happen, and that's what we call a hard task, in fact. So I think at this point in time, what I would suggest on this one, if you can't find the information in the training material, then please send us a query to the service desk, and then we will assist.
All right, thank you both very much. Now we will continue with the first demo session on substantial modifications that will be presented by Noemi. Noemi, back to you.
Thank you, Vicky. So what I will be doing now is that, as you can see from the screen here, is that I've already actually logged in. I've logged in the Sandbox. This is the current training environment that we were using. And I have logged as a sponsor. And as you can see, I've got access to various tabs. And what I will do today is that I will want to prepare a substantial modification. So as I would like to particularly, I'm particularly interested in looking at preparing a substantial modification for a trial that has been authorized. I will then search my trials that are currently in an authorized status, and I will focus on those. So what I've got here is a list of trials, and I will navigate to the first one that is in fact a mononational trial. And I come to this screen, and from this screen, this is where I can basically operate and start drafting my substantial modification. So here, what it is that it's one trial that is currently ongoing in one member state. This member state has received the initial application. They have already authorized one substantial modification, as I can see from this dashboard here. And maybe this dashboard is very small. I don't know. So let's have a look. Maybe I can increase it. That's probably better, no? I guess. So as we can see, so I've got currently, I can see an initial application that was authorized. I've got a substantial modification part one that was authorized in the past, and I've got a draft substantial modification currently that is the one that I would like to access. So in fact, but this way I can't actually show you how to prepare this substantial modification. So what I've just done is I've just basically canceled it. So as we see now, I've only got an initial application and a part 1 substantial modification. So what I will do is that I will want to create a new one. So here I access this create button and I click on create a single trial substantial modification. As you can see from this menu, I could do different actions. Today we're focusing on the substantial modification for a single trial. The multi-trial substantial modification comes very handy when obviously this is we are looking at modifying the same document for several trials that share the same product and exactly the same version of the product needs to be said. And it would be that in case I would want to update the investigator's brochure, for instance, or I would want to potentially upload also the IMPD as well, the new IMPD. But the focus of today is really very much to focus on one single trial. And what I'm about to do is then create this substantial modification. As you can see, I come to this menu here, and I would like you to understand that this menu here is quite important because I've got the choice here to straight away to tell the system that I want to prepare a part 1 only, a part 2 only, or a part 1 and part 2. If I do a part 1 only, obviously I can't go back and then say, oh, actually, no, this should also include part 2s. So it's important at this point in time to know the scope of the substantial modification that you wish to prepare. One thing to be said is that if I do select part 1 and part 2, I will have the option to decide to only submit the part 1 if I want to, or to submit the part 1 and some of the part 2s. So you might be always better off to, if you not sure about the scope, to always go for the full preparation of the substantial modification and to say part 1, part 2. So this is the way I will do. So in this case, obviously, I've selected the part 2s because I've only got one member state. I can select, my member state is already selected. In the event that I would have several member states, I could actually decide to select some, but or none. So this is really up to me. And then I would create it. So as soon as I click create, I come into drafting a draft application, and you can see the draft being prepared with the information there on the user interface with draft. And all I need to do here is to navigate down, and obviously I've got the dossier that is presented here in a very similar fashion that what you've seen for the initial application. I've got on the left-hand side the form, the MSc, the part 1, part 2, and then obviously the evaluation, but this is once the application has been submitted, and the timetable obviously as well. So what's interesting for the substantial modification is that what you will have that you don't have in an initial application is that the form section is articulated in a slightly different way. What we have here is that we have to obviously provide the cover letter. Obviously, this is not new. We had it in the initial application. But here we have a mandatory document that you can see from the asterisk here that needs to be provided as this is called the modification description. That will need to be populated. And obviously, you would do your population in the same way. You add a document, you click on it, and then you can call out the document that you want to upload. So here I've selected a document that is obviously the list of the modification or the modification description. As you can see, the document upload is presented in a completely similar way as what you've seen for the initial application. Obviously, because I'm in the form here, any document that I would have uploaded here will have a system version of 1. All these documents are obviously new and they are specific for that substantial modification application. Obviously, I can change the language and I can change the date and put the date in the past. Obviously, this is very similar to what we've seen for the initial application. So here what I've done is that I've uploaded my list of modification that is mandatory. I will also need to have my cover letter. And what you see down below is something that you don't see obviously for the initial application. This is the substantial modification reasons. So here what we have is a drop down. This drop down has been provided there very much for probably reporting purposes in the future, because I'm sure that as a sponsor you would certainly give the reasons why you're doing this substantial modification in the cover letter. But here you have the ability to actually tick the various sections of this drop down, and it's quite useful because in fact you have the restart the trial. So that would be quite useful in case you would want to do the because your trial is on hold, for instance. So you will have the ability to tick that particular drop down, and then in the other box that you see here, you have the ability to inform further on the scope of the changes. So here again, very much for reporting purposes, this is quite interesting to have it as structured data. So here, what you will have the ability to do is to say whether you're changing the CTA application form, whether you're changing any of the documents. One thing to be said is that this is in no way linked to the changes you will do to the dossier. It's not a very clever way to say, oh, actually you ticked that you were changing informed consent, therefore you will change informed consent in the part 1. In fact, this is not linked. This is important to mention. The system is there to provide information, but it's not going to, even if you were not to tick the part 1 information here to say that I'm changing the protocol and I'm changing the investigator's brochure, the system is not going to then tell you, oh, sorry, you can't change the GMP documentation because you didn't tick it. No, absolutely not. It's not done in such a clever way. Huh? Okay, so then what we see also in this section is obviously the because I've ticked, as you must remember, I've actually informed the system that I want to restart my trial, and what I would need to do here is to provide the anticipated trial restart date, and obviously that needs to be in the future. And I need to take account of the time of assessment, and I need to foresee when I will be ready to restart. So I will probably provide a date in the future, which will be, let's say, the 1st of July. And then there is obviously a section on the proof of payment that can be logged in to obviously upload the documentation if it is required by the member states. In this section, I will also have the ability to update, and here it's an interesting one that we can look at together. I will have the ability to update my compliance with the regulation documentation that I would have signed and already provided at the time of the initial application. I've used the word sign. Apologies, colleague. It means that it's not necessarily need to be signed, but it certainly needs to be provided to the system. I think we've confirmed that we would provide a template for this compliance with the regulation. This is still on hold, so just wait for the information to come through. So I apologize again. I did use the word sign, but it may not need to be signed as such. Huh? So then what I would like to just demonstrate here is that what's interesting is that if you were to actually wanting to upload an update to the documentation, you have various icons here that you can use. And what I would like to draw your attention to is the icon that is called the update icon. This update is particularly interesting and important if you were to update information to Ctis. Why? Because in case of an update, this is the latest update. This is the latest information that you would have provided, because in fact you want to replace the one that was there before, but this is considered an updated documentation that then needs to be published as such. So just to demonstrate, so if I were now to update this information, let's imagine that this is my the documents that I want to update. The system is just busy trying to upload the documents. So now I have actually updated my document, the subfolder with a new document, and I'm just going to inform the system that this is, or the member said that this is my version 2, and this is an update to the compliance documentation. Okay, so then I click the update button, and now what we can see that the system has registered this document as a system version 2, and the previous information can be found there as is. But what's interesting and important is that the latest information that I've just updated, once my application is actually authorized, will be published as for the public to see. So this is important because, in fact, by this mean, you can certainly update information for the public to see without having to be confused with the previous information that may have been submitted in the past. So I think this is something to bear in mind, especially when you update the information to part 1 and part 2. So then we've actually updated this information. As I said, you will not be able to update any information in relation to deferral at this point in time. So then when we move to the dossier in part 1, I will have the ability to actually update the information as well, or to provide new information. So in the part 1, if I were to look at the protocol information, and if I were to, because I have had some changes to the trial, I've got a new safety section, or I have another several information to give in relation to the product, for instance, then I prepare a new protocol version, and this is where again this button that I've just demonstrated on the update functionality is very useful, because then I can update I can upload a new protocol version, and then inform the member state that this is version 3A, for instance. And as I said, this now we can see the history of the document. We can see version 1 that was submitted in the past, and that was system version 1. I can see the second version that was submitted later on. And then I can see this latest version that I've just submitted. What I've noticed as well is that I did not update the document version, which I would like to do. And I will say that this document version is dated of the 15th of May. And what I can just see now is that my document version has been updated there. I've got version 3. And what I want to point out is that when this application will be decided upon, this is the latest version that will be shown on the public website as the current information on the trial. So this is important to note, because if I now would have done, let's remove this version that I've just updated. So now if That was the state of the information as it was before I actually did anything. Now, if I had uploaded a new document, and if I had uploaded the very same document that I initially shared with you here, and I had done just by adding, and I had said this is protocol version 3, as we can see, the two documents, so let's say the previous document that had been submitted for the initial application that had been authorized is then shown alongside the very new one that I've just uploaded. Okay, so what I want to say is that as you see it today, it means that those two documents would be published for the public. It means that even if so, and maybe it's correct, to be fair, it might be correct, but I just want to point out that obviously you can use the functionality in order to better show the information that you've updated in your trial. So obviously in this section, you can certainly add a document because you would like to add a document to complement the current version of the protocol that is still valid. Or you may want to use the update functionality because, in fact, your version has been updated and therefore you would want to only convey this very version to the public. And that's a way to actually use the update functionality. Okay, and then, so if we carry on, obviously, we can do unmodified, even the structured data, and that's something you could do within the trial information. You could certainly add further on or clarified further the main objectives. If you had wanted to, you can clarify the structured data that you had initially provided. And obviously, this is in a very similar way that's what you would do for an initial application. Okay, so I think I've demonstrated this part 1 here. I think I will stop here for the part 1. And for the part 2, very much the technique, the method is very much the same. You would navigate to the part 2, and then in the part 2, you can certainly, you log the section, and in the section, you can upload new document, you can update document that are no longer or that needs to be updated because they are not longer valid, let's say, because you're submitting a substantial modification. So you can certainly do that in a very similar way that's what I've just demonstrated. Okay, so that comes to the end of this very first demonstration. So shall we take any question, Vicky and Peter?
Yes, Noemi, thank you very much. It was very nicely presented, and I think our user will find it very useful. Let me share now again the questions. And yes, we can take, again, we can begin with top questions, the most popular ones. So, first one, can documents be implemented after submission of an NSA subsequently assessed as substantial modification by the RMS, as is very often now the case, at least in Germany? This would be a regulatory problem. So,
I think this is probably as there is a specific member state mentioned, and if you think that you would encounter this issue, I think I would want to refer you to discuss the topic with the RMS directly. I don't think we can answer this question particularly here, unless yeah.
Indeed.
okay, next question. When, let me highlight it. When we create a substantial modification, we select part 1 and part 2 if we're not sure, instead of only part 1 or 2? Or no, it's not the question. Does this require that all member states will be selected? Can the selected member state changed before submitting this substantial modification when we have only part 2? Can the selected member state be changed before submitting the substantial modification when we have only part 2?
Okay, so on this one, I can certainly, I've intended to do a demonstration with multiple MSCs, so we can look at that, how to do this. Now, I think I was just mentioning that you've got this drop down, so we can look at it when I do the demo. I think it might be easier to try to answer that questions. On the last point, can the selected member state change before submitting the SM when we have only part 2? And I will demonstrate how you do the part 2s. Again, let's go back to the demonstration in a minute, yeah, to answer the question.
All right, thank you. Next question. When is it expected to have the option for submitting 81.9 non-substantial modification in Ctis?
I think on this one, it's just whenever you will have the trial authorized, you will be able to submit non-substantial modification. I think currently you can already, yeah? This is possible to do. Now, 81.9 non-substantial modification are quite specific and especially mentioned in the Q&A of the commission. So you can refer to those, but today the system should allow you to submit non-substantial modification now.
Right, thank you. Moving on, I'm going to read the next one. Compliance with Regulation 2016-679 is already explicitly asked for to be signed by the sponsor by the German BFARM. This was the case for a submission still with the old legislations. How can it be justified not to be signed?
So this is probably related to the comment that I was making in terms of the template that will be communicated to the user community, and also so whether this template include a signature, I do not know at this point in time. I think it's important to mention that it's very true that some member states had different requirement in terms of what needed to be signed and not to be signed. Now, I can't comment about one particular member state, and I think what's probably important to think is to, first of all, we know that there will be a template coming up. This template will be endorsed by the Commission and the member states. So I think this should be enabling all of us to have some standardization in terms of this particular requirement of the regulation.
All right. Thank you. Next question. How much detail should be included in the modification description document?
I think on this one, this is not a CTIS functionality as such. I think, again, use your procedures in house to know how much details you need to put. You need to obviously support the member states. So I think this is what you need to put your mind. In order to know how much details you need to put, think that you need to support the member state. You need to try to have the best dossier in place to facilitate their assessment, to prevent several RFIs, etc. So think about it and what would be the most useful for them.
If I can add, thank you on this. This is a question which often comes back, and in the Q&A of the Commission, it's also mentioned. I just go back one step at the beginning. In the Q&A of the Commission, they state submit a quality dossier, not only an SM, a quality dossier that with this, with a good initial, well thought, you reduce the need for upcoming substantial modifications and you make your life and that of the authorities much easier if you submit well prepared dossiers. I come from a national agency indeed previously. Member states have a lot of work with the substantial modifications which in fact seen afterwards could be avoided if the dossier was well prepared upfront. Hoping that this helps you in the answer. Addressing this, take the problem at the root, prepare better your initials before you submit. Thank you.
Thank you both for responding to that. So the next question asks, track changes versions an additional document summarizing the changes of the document should be filed along with a clean version in the Part 1 form. Example, protocol. How and where are these to be uploaded?
So that's a good question because in fact we certainly did receive the question last time as well. I think the track changes document version, I think, as Peter mentioned, is one way to facilitate also the list, the review of the changes that took place. Member states are very keen on those, and I think how to submit it. I think we can look at it in a minute. But the functionality is there to add a document, so it can certainly be presented alongside the clean version of the protocol, for instance. So this is probably how to answer how and where. So the suggestion is to put it alongside the document to which it's related to. I think that's probably fair as a response.
Great. We can take a couple more questions before the next demo session and last. So next question, do we receive a signed decision letter as an initial application when a substantial modification is accepted?
So on this particular topic, there are, I think member state will currently probably act according to their own procedures. But one thing to clarify is that with the current CTIS functionality, you can download what we call the structured data that will give you in a structured way the decision by that specific member state. So currently it's available in CTIS through the download functionality. Now, some member states will also upload a document within the decision. At the time when they actually submit their decision, they have the ability to upload a document, and that document could well be a decision letter. But this upload is not mandatory, so it is up to the member state to see and to decide how they will want to convey on top of the structured data that you can already download, establish the way to communicate their decision. That's one point. And also it needs to be commented that in part 1 and part 2, you also have the assessment report. Assessment report is a mandatory document. So within those, you should also have the conclusion to the part 1 and the part 2. And that comes obviously alongside the decision, the final decision.
Thank you. We will pause here and let me give you presenter eyes so we can continue with the last live demo session presented by Noemi. And over to you.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Vicky. So, as I said, we had the intention to present you also a demonstration on how to prepare a substantial modification for a multi-MS application. So here, what I have in this list is a trial that is for 2 member states. So then what I will do is that I will select this trial and I will create a substantial modification. And I think there was a question about how to go about selecting whether it's for multi-member states and if I can actually decide not to submit it to all those member states. So what I wanted to demonstrate here is that if I select part 1 only, in such a case, obviously, I cannot also try to submit when I would have finished this part 1 only substantial modification. I can't go back and then add to this application the part 2. So this is why it's important to know the scope at the very start. So if I here select part 2 only, when I select part 2, I can decide to do Germany and Iceland, or I can decide to do so I create my part 2 only for Germany, and I could later on come back and prepare the part 2 for Iceland. So this is the way the system is set up. Then now here in the part 1 and part 2, I've selected part 1. For sure, part 1 will be prepared, and then here I can decide whether the part 2 is for Germany or also for Iceland. So this is where it's an interesting feature, because here, if I do this, I basically prepare a draft application that includes part 1, that includes part 2 for Iceland, and that includes part 2 for Germany. But what I wanted to flag is that at the end, when I'm ready, when I've completed my draft application and it's actually ready to be submitted, I can actually decide at this point in time not to submit the part 2s. I certainly can decide to do so. I can select what section I'm willing to submit to the member state. So this is why I was saying that maybe you need to obviously consider this various functionalities, but what's important is to understand that at the time when you prepare your substantial modification, you need to know the scope. And if you're not too sure, what I'm advising is to use the very full scope. I hope that that clarifies. So now I'm currently then in a draft application for that includes a part 1 and a part 2 for 2 member states. In a very similar way, I will have to complete the form in a very similar way that's what I've already presented to you. I will have the ability to navigate to the member states subsection. And here, as you can see, I can certainly but modify the number of subjects. So if initially it wasn't 10, but it was 20 that I wanted to recruit in that member state, I would then have the ability to do so. So this is what I can see here, and I can increase the number of subjects. Okay. Then, but what I could not do, and I think even if the button here exists, and you can see it here, I'm currently browsing on it, I cannot click on it. The button is there because obviously it's the same kind of UI that for an initial application, but obviously I'm not able in a substantial modification to add a member state. And that's not the purpose of the substantial modification. If you wish to add a member state, a new member state, you will need to use Article 14, and this is using the application of add an additional MSC. Okay, so then we've demonstrated this section on the MSC. Then the part 1 is presented in a very similar fashion to what we've already seen for the previous mononational trial. What needs to be said is that because I've prepared the part 1, when I submit the part 1, it will be submitted to all member states concerned in this application, even if I do not include a part 2 for Iceland. or Germany. All the member states involved in the trial will assess jointly the part 1, and this is the purpose of the clinical trial regulation. The part 1 will be submitted to all, and they can jointly assess. Then in the part 2, obviously, in a slightly different way than what we've seen before. Here I've got 2 member states, and obviously for those 2 member states, I can revisit the part 2, I can make changes, I can certainly add a site if I need to. I can remove that site if I actually decided if that site has been closed. I can add a site. I can certainly modify slightly the information that are linked to that site if I need to. If the phone number was incorrect, I can rectify it. I can certainly add a site. And this is currently what I'm currently doing. So we can see that I've just added the new site. And what I will need to do, obviously, is to inform on who this on some details here to that's it. So I've just added a new site, and what I can certainly do now is to proceed to update some of the documentation. As we know, site suitability is mandatory, so potentially I will need to then revisit the suitability of the facilities. And the way to do this is to either this site suitability is still valid because it applies to the other site. So what I can do is to add a document, or what I could also do is to potentially have the one PDF that is related to the 2 sites. So it's very much up to your to the way you actually intend to work and use the system. Huh? Okay, so I think here if there's no more to show in a very similar way that's what I've already demonstrated. And here, in same as what we've seen for the member state Germany, we have the one for Iceland, and it's the same thing. So here, as you probably know, that has been presented to you in the initial application, I could do the update directly within a list of updates if I wanted to, by going through this functionality, all documents, or I can navigate to the placeholder and do the update directly in the placeholder. So that's very much you would like to use the system functionalities. Okay, so once I'm ready to submit, I can certainly use the check button in the same way as we've done in the past. And as it was demonstrated to you for the initial application. Here I can see that I've got a document missing. So I can revisit this and see what is missing. And clearly I've not uploaded the cover letter, which I will do just now. So I'm uploading the cover letter, and what I'm also doing is that I will upload the list or the modification description, which will be this document. Okay, so that's fine. And then what I will then now proceed to do is to make sure that I've actually included all the documentation that I wish to include. So this is checked now, and I've included everything I wanted to include. And now I can submit my substantial modification. Okay, so obviously I've got some warnings because I've got some various information and subsection that are currently locked. So I'm not able to submit. I just need to go back and revisit my application to make sure that all the sections are unlocked. It's good. And here, I think it's part 2. Here we go. and the part 2 as well. Okay, so now let's do it again. Let's try to submit. Okay, so this is what I wanted to demonstrate to you. So now, as we know, the scope that I had chosen was a substantial modification that was at the remit of the change to part 1, part 2 for Germany, and part 2 for Iceland. Now, it could well be that I'm not fully ready for Germany, so therefore I don't wish to submit it, and I could then just elect to just do the part 2 for Iceland. This is a possibility at this point in time. The other possibility is that, in fact, I don't think I need to do any changes to part 2. Therefore, I don't need to submit any of the part 2s. So this is why I wanted to show you that at the point of submission, you can actually select the parts you wish to submit. Yeah. So in the same way as well, I can remove the part 1, but as you've just seen, I remove the part 1. At this point in time, I can only select whether I want to submit part 2 or for Germany or part 2 for Iceland, in a very similar way that what I was explaining before. So I'm not going to submit it at this point in time, but this is so this would be the end of the demonstration on the substantial modification. And this is obviously for a multi-MS substantial modification. So thank you.
Thank you again, Noemi. Thank you very much. And now we will proceed to the final Q&A session. And here we are. So while you take a moment to take a breath, I will read the first question and you will decide who will respond to it. Just for confirmation, only the latest approved or rejected version of a document will be published and not the previous submitted and authorized version.
So I think what needs to be clarified here is that if we have a trial with multiple applications, it's always all applications are published. All latest documents of that application are published. Okay, so that needs to be understood. Because here, the way I read the question is that it says not the previous submitted unauthorized version. I'm afraid that if you had an initial application, that initial application was authorized, then it is published, obviously. Yeah? But within this initial application, it's only the latest decided, so approved or rejected version that are published. Now, if later on in time, once the trial and this initial application was approved, you submit a substantial modification, that substantial modification will have some documents that would have modified the previous submitted document. Then what will happen is that from that application, the latest approved document will be published. But then obviously from the initial application, the user on the public website is always able to go back to the previous applications. If you become familiarized with the public website, and I think we will have at some point a bite-sized talk on that, we will explain how to actually access the information. But what's important to understand is that within an application, if you were to have an RFI, it's important to understand that it's the latest updated document that is published. I think the functionalities that I was presenting today is important because obviously if you want to ensure that the document that was initially submitted but was questioned and that need an update by the member state, I would really recommend that you use the update functionality to make sure that the previous document is indeed not published, because otherwise it can create confusion.
Many thanks. Moving on to the next one. Will the TC versions also require a for publication version?
So within the system, the track changes documentation can certainly be uploaded with a possibility for publication and not for publication. So the functionality exists there. Now the question is whether it needs to be for publication. I must say this is the question we're currently putting towards the Commission and the member states, because obviously we understand there would have been a clean version. So is the track changes version really required for the public? I must say I can't answer on this one particularly today.
Right, moving on to the next one. For a trial to be transitional, will documents already approved under the clinical trial directive have to be revised according to the clinical trial regulation requirements? For example, IMP labels.
Thank you for the question. I think I'm just liaising with Peter on this one, and I think it's clear that you do not need to revise the information as per the CTR requirement, especially for the IMP label. You don't need to do it at the time when the information is transitioned from the CTD to the clinical trial regulation. So you just need to provide the information as it was approved under the CTD, and then a decision will be made. Then once you are following your trial according to the clinical trial regulation, I think at this point in time, if you were to do a substantial modification, you might have to apply the rules of the clinical trial regulation, but not at the time of the transitioning. So if that clarifies it.
Right, moving on to the next one. Can the sponsor create a new organization for an investigator site that is not registered yet in OMS?
So the sponsor can create a site in OMS. Yes, they have to do it in OMS first. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. How can a dummy trial within the Sandbox training environment be approved in order to access additional functionality post-approval?
I'm sure Noemi knows the answer. Please. Either a member state who having access can promote the trial, or perhaps if you want to explain the project we are working on, but it's unconfirmed yet. But a member state can do it.
Yeah, I think you could contact the national contact points of the member states that you're liaising with in the environment, in the training environment. Contact the national contact points and ask them whether they could. I'm sure if you ask them nicely, they will certainly approve your trial, and this way you can further trial the other functionalities. The list of contact points is published on the European Commission website.
I think so, yes.
And we have the link.
It is, yes, it's in the UDRLX volume 10 under chapter 5, the last document. And it gets updated regularly, so make sure you have the latest information there. So thank you both. Moving on to the next question. A cover letter of a substantial modification 1 should be uploaded with the update button or with the add document button. The first option would replace the initial cover letter, and the second would add a cover letter in the system. Which is the best approach?
So, in fact, when I did the demonstration on the for the cover letter, I must say the cover letter has to be uploaded fresh. You don't actually replace the previous one that would have been submitted within the initial application. The cover letter is really inherent to the application, and it's associated with the particular application. So what you would need to do is to use the functionality add.
Great, thank you.
Mm,
Moving on, if validated patient questionnaires are not available in the initial application, will this raise an RFI or will the application be rejected? Can the questionnaires be submitted as a substantial modification after initial application part 1 and plus 2 approval?
so this is really not a specific question for CTIS functionalities, but what we can probably inform the user community is that currently the Commission is liaising with the member state on establishing which are the participants facing documents that would need to be submitted for approval. So there is currently discussion on this topic within the CTAG, and that clarification will come through certainly through either a question and answer within the European Commission documents. So let's hope for clarification to come through soon.
Thank you. Next question. Might a protocol update be a non-substantial modification? And which changes are accepted are not as non-substantial modifications?
No, on this one, I would want to direct you towards the Q&A of the Commission, and if you need further clarification, please contact the member state. It's not a CTIS functionality.
Right. Moving on, is there a download function available for modification description?
It's a very good question. I can't answer it. I would have guessed that this modification documentation would have been part of the download. But if you're asking the question and you feel that it's not there, then all I can say, please raise a ticket with the service desk.
Thank you. Can the modification description section be filled out directly with free text or will a document upload be needed? I think it's in the presentation, maybe we have.
Yes, I think that's a good point, but I must say, I'm just checking now. I think the document upload is mandatory, although it's true that there is a text box, but I don't think the text box is sufficient. No, the text box is for supporting information. So indeed, it's mandatory to upload a document.
Yes, thank you. For a trial to be transition, and this will be our final question for today, if you agree. Do you want to handpick one? Okay. For a trial to be transitioned, if all documents are harmonized in all countries, no substantial modification would be needed. Then, to transition, you have to prepare such docs for publication as per transparency rules and request the deferral. Is this correct?
Okay, so I think on this particular one, I can certainly say that yes, you can request a deferral. The system will enable you to do so. Now, do you need to prepare the documentation in order to think about publication? I would say also yes, you would need to think about that. So yes, the answer is yes to those questions.
All right. So we have concluded our last Q&A session. And before closing this event, let me share my screen again. All right, perfect. We would like to thank our speakers, Noemi and Peter, and thank you all for submitting your questions live so far. But I would like to ask you to keep your Slido session open, as we would now like to ask you to participate in a short poll that I will open right after we close this event and will remain open for a while after the session. We just ask you to provide us with your satisfaction feedback and for suggestions for this talk and for suggestions for future talks. Bite-sized talks is planned to continue through this year, 2022. And please note that the questions that you have submitted today will be used as an input to EMA training and support materials. As you may have seen, this presentation is already uploaded and published in the webpage, in the event webpage, and the recording of this event will become available on the same page following this talk. This may take up to 60 days as per our multimedia policy, thus we recommend attendees to sign up to the clinical trials newsletter for information on when the videos are published and also on upcoming events. Our next bite-sized talk will be on the 23rd of June, and we will talk about transitional trials and additional member state concerned application. In the meantime, you can make good use of the CTI's walk-in clinics where you can come in with any question, any kind of question CTI's functionalities and get it answered. The next walk-in clinics are scheduled for the 2nd and the 15th of June. Having said all that, I would like to thank you very much for your attendance today. Again, thank our speakers and wish you a lovely evening.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thank you very much to Vicky.